Okay, part two. So, Harlem Renaissance. So, characteristics of the Harlem Renaissance, racial pride. So, as I said, the whole idea of feeling psychologically battered in the sense that you have no self worth. So, it's very important that people need to feel that they are useful. People need to feel something about their own self worth. So, what a society that continually um, is using its discourses to other the in this case the African American. Well, that's going to create a psychic instability. So the Harlem Renaissance is all about a celebration of Africana. It's a celebration. It's trying to break out of all these racial stereotypes. It's trying to create something. And you talk about the idea of uplifting. Okay, and this also they used religion a lot because a lot of African Americans were deeply religious. So in a sense, they would look to themselves as needing, as the Israelites needed to leave Israel or to leave Egypt and to go back to the Promised Land. In a sense, they also felt that they were being enslaved by this foreign, this imposed sort of ideology, and that they needed to go back to some sort of Promised Land. So in certain parts of the African American experience, there's this idea of back to Africa experience. The back to Africa experience was especially configured by a Jamaican author who I can't remember now. I'll tell you now in a minute who he is. So that was very important. Okay. Marcus Garvey, sorry. So Garvey taught, and Garvey, even though Garvey was Jamaican, he actually develops his whole back to African movement in the United States. So, and he is a part of the later Harlem movement. Okay, so that's happening there, and of course it's framed within this with the Jim Crow, obviously the Jim Crow racial laws of segregation. It's the most kind of blatant, if you like, it's the most blatant kind of expression of white supremacy. Okay. Now, we move on to our next slide, another one of the very influential members of the Harlem Renaissance is Langston Hughes. Interestingly, Langston Hughes he's of mixed heritage. So on one hand, his roots are he was from Chicago, but his roots were in Kentucky. And so he was both his grandparents on one side were enslaved African Americans, while on his paternal side, they were actually slave owners. So in a sense, the history, like the history, all histories, there are certain ambiguities. There is an ambiguity here. Here's a man who himself is hybrid. Obviously, culturally, you would say he's of mixed heritage, mulatto, mestissage, whatever you like to call it. But obviously, he focuses on his Africanity. Okay, but I think that's all. That in itself, I think that in itself is in a sense it's interesting, because I remember I was at a conference a good few years back. And I met an African American woman. She was an academic, and again, she was from a mixed heritage. She had African roots, but also she had roots from Sweden, and you could see it in her physically. But she said that she just ignored that white part of her, and decided to focus on the African part of her. So in a sense, that what it tells us something that tells us is that identities are performative. They're not essential. So by actually African American identity is in itself has a performative nature. Okay? So, and in a sense, again, Hughes, I think, in a sense, focuses more on that, on that aspect, the constructed nature of it, and how, in the same way, if an identity is constructed, well, why not construct something in a more positive light, considering that you have been othered by dominant discourse? So. Also, a lot of this African Americans, they were very much drawn to Marxist theory, to communism, because communism in itself, as an ideology, even though this in fact wasn't practiced, supposedly communism shouldn't have had a racial component. It looked at societies through class and not through race. So that's why a lot of the early African Americans were drawn to this, because obviously capitalism, inherent in capitalism, was slavery. The birth of modern capitalism is born on the backs of labor, forced labor in the case of slavery. And also modern capitalism is born on the back of colonialism and imperialism. So communism seemed to them to be a way of reconfiguring their own identity. If you fast forward to the African American movement in the 1960s, there's more of a move towards Islam. And it's for the same reason, because it's supposed that if you convert to Islam, you're a Muslim, well then you're a Muslim. And there is no racial component in that, you're a brother. So that's why you saw, like the Islam Brotherhood in the United States, became very prominent, because that message of belonging to some sort of like ideology that wasn't racist was very appealing, and it gave people self-esteem. It gave them a sense of worth. So moving back to Langston Hughes, he founds the Skyloft Players in 1941. And what he tries to do there is to nurture black playwrights. So it's the idea of forming this kind of new way of expressing their own issues, what's happening in their society. Because if you think about it, if you remember back to our class on cultural hegemony, and we talked about Antonio Gramsci. Cultural hegemony is a way of creating this kind of dominant culture through all different kinds of cultural artifacts that impose a certain ideology, a certain way of thinking. So obviously the black experience is not, you're not going to find any you're not meaningful black characters within white literature, film, dance, etc. So I would invite you just to look a little bit at the history, even for example the history of like tap dance. Fred Astaire was known as the as he was the first person who actually brought this genre to cinema. But we all know that tap dance was an African American cultural phenomenon, which Fred Astaire appropriated. Now he recognized that, but that's just one of many examples of how African Americans were invisible. So coming into discourse, becoming visible, well, that was the part of the thing, and that's something that we can still see today. So On the next slide, I'm just continuing with Langston Hughes. You have there his novel Not Without Laughter and the Ways of White Folks, which is a collection of short stories. Also, in Langston Hughes, what he does is obviously on a technical level, he tries to use the rhythms, the folk rhythms, the rhythms of jazz, and somehow transport that kind of aesthetics into his writing itself. Okay, and I'm just going to read out a sentence here which says, he advocates an identity grounded upon cultural traditions, but not on the concepts of common ancestry or race, which is cultural nationalism. So he's looking at culture from cultural tradition, something, the idea of something is a non-essential way of looking at culture. Now, he influenced Langston Hughes, and as I said, he influenced a lot of African intellectuals. The first one, was Leopold Sédar Senghor. He was the first prime minister of Senegal after the independence, and then there was another Martinique intellectual, Aimé Césaire. Excuse my crap French pronunciation, and those two black intellectuals that I've just mentioned formed a part which was called the Negritude movement. Okay, so this has got to do with the idea of the local and the global. So the local Harlem Renaissance and the African American, this idea, African American identities, cultural identities, is something that influenced a lot the Negritude movement in Black Africa. Now, the actual Negritude movement itself was more a francophone phenomenon in the Anglophone colonies of, like, for example, Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon. Negritude wasn't really it wasn't really a thing. So the idea, I think, what Negritude had in common with the Harlem Renaissance was this idea of celebrating Africanness, celebrating this African spirit, this kind of trying to remove the shackles of not just the physical kind of colonial experience in the case of Africa, or this cultural in slavery, if you wanted to look at in America. The idea of actually trying to reconfigure their identity by going back to this other past. Now, obviously, this was criticized by certain intellectuals, even black African intellectuals usually from Anglophone speaking worlds, who saw Negritude as being a kind of a stereotypical or an essentialist construction. My personal take is that obviously Negritude was a good thing. It was an important thing. It was a thing of much how would I say, inspiration. It was very inspirational, even though maybe if you want from an intellectual point of view, it might be essentially a little bit kind of black and white. They were trading in certain kinds of stereotypes, like the black person is this, the white person is that. You were moving into kind of stereotypical thinking, but it was very important. So these are what are known as Afrocentric theorists, okay, and talk about the cultural inheritance with Africa. Paul Gilroy himself does take certain issue with something, because what Gilroy says is that they don't take into consideration the cultural hybridization. So even Langston Hughes himself is hybrid, not just because of his different ethnic backgrounds, but also the fact that the African Americans they are also American. They form a part of the American experience. So you can't just transport yourself back to this sort of like pre-lapsarian African past. But anyway, it certainly, the two did feed into each other. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't rambled too much. It's the first time I've done something like this. Now in my second video, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the playwright and the writer James Baldwin, who will be featured in I'm Not Your Negro, and he's actually in the series of texts that I've uploaded by Terence Hayes. There is a poem that is dedicated to James Baldwin. Okay, guys, thank you very much and be safe.